Hi, I'm Kay Whitt, designer for Serendipity Studio, and today I would love to share with you one of my very favorite techniques for finishing a neckline, a hemline, the edge of a sleeve, or an armhole. It's my bias binding contrast that I like to add instead of a facing or a turned up hem. It gives you a chance to add a little extra pop of color to your project. Before we get started, I would like to show you some samples that I brought just so that you can see how this technique looks when it's finished. So over here on my finished samples, you can see that I've got a bias trim added here. It picks up this teal color in my fabric, and then down here, because this is a tulip skirt, I decided to make the skirt the charcoal color, and you can see how you really can see the teal contrast here along the edges. On the other sample, you can see that I chose to use this sort of a lime green color, and I put it along the neckline and along the armhole. This technique can also be done against the other side of the fabric if you would prefer to turn it to the inside and not see the trim at all, and you still have a nice finished edge. So what I would like to do is to get started, start with my bias. And what I've done here is you want to cut on a 45-degree angle. And this is a 2 1/4 inch wide strip. That's usually my default for what I like to use on this particular technique. So what we would do is this would be pressed in half. So we're reducing it by half the width. And you can see now that I've got a nice folded edge and I have the cut edges. Once I have a series of those strips, before I do the pressing, I actually piece them with a 1/4 inch seam along the angled edges and press the seam open and then fold so that I can create as long of a strip as needed to finish whatever edge that I'm working on. So I've got a sample in progress here that we'll be working on today. You can see on the skirt that I've already added the trim, and note how this color picks up the red through the print. Now I chose to do that instead of the blue because if I chose the blue, then that trim would probably get lost in the print. If you have trouble selecting fabrics, a lot of times it's a good idea to use a collection that has coordinates because they've done the work for you. And so those prints will automatically just work together and it makes your job easier. So that's what I recommend if you're just starting out trying to figure out what fabrics you like to put together. So before we get started to adding this trim, we need to complete a 1/4 inch stay stitching from the edge. And you can see that I've already done part of the edge, and that's just a 1/4 inch in. And the reason that you want to do that, particularly on a neckline, is that this neckline has some curve to it. And when you wear it, you don't want any distortion, or after you wash it, you don't want it to waffle. And the stay stitching helps to stabilize the seam before you add your trim. Notice on the dress that I'm wearing, I have used this same technique, but I decided to use the same fabric as the dress was made from because I didn't really want the contrast for this particular dress. So you can see how this technique looks if you choose that option. So let's go ahead and get some stay stitching done, and then we can add the trim to the bodice. So I've left just a little bit of trim here, of the edge here that I haven't stay stitched. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that, and then we'll add the contrasting trim. Again, this is 1/4 inch from the edge. Okay, so I've got, I used white thread on this particular one. You can see it, it's a contrast here, but you know, that's probably the color that I would use while I'm stitching this particular one because you can see how it does blend in with the back. Now it's time to add the bias binding. I don't want to add it to the right side of the fabric. I prefer to add it to the wrong side so that when it's finished, it will show from the outside, from the right side of the dress. So here's the bias binding. I'm going to add it to the lower edge of the bodice at the center front. Notice how I've got just a little bit hanging over. I'll trim that off later. And we'll do this with a 3/8 inch seam. So just back stitch a little bit at the beginning of my seam, and we'll add this bias binding. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, why am I using a bias for this particular technique? Well, the reason is because this neckline has a curve to it. And when you cut fabric on a bias, you get a little bit of stretch, and that helps you go around those curves, and it makes it a smoother finish. It's just easier and better all the way around. So we'll zip around this neckline, and then we'll be ready to iron. Okay, we're almost around to the other side here. We'll back stitch. Okay, notice how I had some extra. I'm just going to take my scissors and cut that off even. And I'll do the same thing on this edge. Just cut that off even. Well, I should have my bigger scissors out. Okay, we're going to go to the ironing board now and do a little pressing. So I've got my trim attached to the wrong side of fabric. I'm going to open it out a way and do some pressing here. I will continue to press this around and then fold it to the outside, and look, there's my finished edge. Now once this is all pressed, let's go stitch it. I will be edge stitching the folded edge down first, so that way my trim will stay in place when I get ready to edge stitch the other side. I'm only going to do just a little bit here to demonstrate what this will look like. I would continue to go all the way around, and I'm just giving you an idea of how that's going to look. So here's the edge stitch down. Now I'll do the same thing on the other edge. Okay, that's how it looks. Now let's go back and look at the skirt and see how that looks completely finished. You can see on the inside here how it's nice and neat, smooth. This is really great if you're using a rayon that you can see both sides of the fabric, because then if the wind happens to catch your skirt, it looks really nice on the inside. And you can see how I've got this great print here on the outside, and that's how you add a bias to the edge of a garment.